The Tom Woods Show, episode 1961.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Hey folks, don't even think about missing the libertarian event of the year, the 2000th episode of The Tom Woods Show, live in Orlando, featuring many of your favorites from The Tom Woods Show. And Michael Malice says his special surprise guest, whose identity I myself don't even know, will bring the house down. Cost nothing to attend. Register at tomwoods2000.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. Here is the episode I promised last week where I'm going to go through one of my favorite popular Murray Rothbard pieces. Of course, in terms of scholarly work, that's another question. But in his popular work, I don't know that you're going to beat the speech he gave to the John Randolph Club 1992 that was later published as a piece called A Strategy for the Right, because it combines tremendous learning and Rothbard's unmistakable personality. It just sparkles throughout the whole thing. It is such a pleasure to read from beginning to end. And I'm just going to review some of it with you and offer a few comments. But I remember reading this. This is actually the first thing I ever read by Murray Rothbard. And I read it not originally in its entirety. I read excerpts from it that were published in National Review, which of course is a more or less neoconservative magazine that's been around for a very long time, since the 1950s. I used to subscribe to it when I was in high school and college, when it was much better than it is now, put it that way. And in that magazine, years and years ago, Bill Buckley, he was the editor, William F. Buckley Jr., wrote a very, very long essay called In Search of Anti-Semitism. And it was his attempt to purge the Buchananites from the movement, from the conservative movement. He wants the conservative movement to be respectable, and he's not going to be able to go to the cocktail parties he goes to if Pat Buchanan becomes influential. So he's got to write an article purging Pat Buchanan, because that was Buckley's role for a long time, was he would just purge people who were taking away his coveted respectability. He attacked other people too, his longtime friend Joe Sobran, Gore Vidal, The Nation magazine, and so on and so forth. Well, this long essay provoked some responses. And in A Strategy for the Right, which is the piece I'm going to be talking to you about today, by Murray Rothbard, Rothbard had responses of his own. The Nation magazine responded. There were responses to the essay by Buckley, more or less calling Buchanan an anti-Semite, coming really darn close to it, we'll say. And so there were all these responses. So National Review actually ran a roundtable where they took excerpts from the various responses. So what they did was they took the section of Rothbard's speech, A Strategy for the Right, that dealt with Buckley and his essay, and they just published that part. So that part was the only thing I saw initially. And I had never heard of this guy, Murray Rothbard. Of course, now I know who Murray Rothbard is. I mean, basically the greatest libertarian thinker ever, extraordinarily prolific, an economist with almost no peer, who helped to save the Austrian movement, which was in danger of declining entirely. And his work, Man, Economy, and State, was the pivotal work that held it together. But then, in addition to his unbelievable productivity as an economist, he also wrote outstanding works of history. He wrote works of philosophy. He edited academic journals. He kept up an extraordinary correspondence with a great many important people. It's just amazing, just amazing. I don't know how somebody like him could have existed. His productivity was unmatched, absolutely unmatched. But at that time, as I was just getting to know Rothbard by reading excerpts from his speech in the pages of National Review, and he was critical of National Review for not being principled enough and for not being hardcore enough, I thought, who is this guy? National Review is the standard bearer, I thought. How could somebody be unhappy with National Review and say that we could be harder core than National Review? So naturally, I began to wonder. And eventually, I came to know much more about Rothbard. I went to the Mises University summer program, the week-long program that the Mises Institute puts out, and they were sending me literature by Murray Rothbard. I thought, wait a minute, I know that guy. That's that guy I read, and I thought, this is great. It's an opportunity to read Murray Rothbard. And of course, when you do read Murray Rothbard, you just never look at the world the same way again. So what I'm going to do, and I don't trust my middle-aged memory these days, so I'm going to jot this down. On the show notes page, in addition to sharing with you a strategy for the right, I'm going to share with you a really great essay by Lou Rockwell called Read Rothbard, because Rothbard wrote so much, you may wonder, where do I start? How do I even begin? And so I think Lou did a great job walking through some of the major works and giving you a sense of which ones, depending on your personal interests, you might want to start with and so on. So I'll put that at tomwoods.com/1961. All right, so Rothbard addresses the John Randolph Club. Now, we mentioned the John Randolph Club a couple episodes ago with Tho Bishop and I, but if for some reason you didn't listen to that episode, tisk tisk, that was a good one. They're all good ones. There ain't a bad one among them. Anyway, in that episode, we talked about this gathering that began in the early 1990s between libertarians like Rothbard, who hadn't had a home in the conservative movement. Rothbard was more or less purged because Rothbard was not in favor of the Cold War. He was as anti-communist as you could possibly be, obviously. He was a free market economist and a libertarian, but he didn't like where the Cold War was going. It was building up a huge military-industrial complex that was never going to stop. It wasn't going to go back to normal after the communist threat passed. It was never going to stop. And at the time, and for a long time, people would say, well, I agreed with Rothbard except his foreign policy, whatever, but how can you question him now, right? Isn't that exactly what we have now? Is a military that's it's got Pentagon planners and policymakers who are just in search of an enemy, who are just in search of a justification for the ongoing graft, basically. That's what we have. And that's what Rothbard warned about. If the communists want to take over a lot of countries that are economic basket cases and make them into even worse economic basket cases, this is not actually harmful to us. This is harmful to them. Let them sink all their wealth into these countries and imposing communism on them, and let them do that, okay? Meanwhile, we'll be building up the most prosperous country in the world. And by not intervening, we'll be able to have the moral high ground, looking to the third world and saying, look, you got the Soviet Union running around trying to impose communism on you, but meanwhile, the United States is setting an example for you to see what a real free society is like. That was what Rothbard favored. Well, after the Cold War was over, there were some conservatives who said, okay, now that that's over, let's go back to being a normal country. No giant military, no constantly being at war or the threat of war or a Cold War. Let's just, enough's enough. I mean, this led to terrible, terrible domestic consequences and budgetary consequences and cultural consequences. Let's just forget it. But of course, most conservatives thought, what are you talking about? We got this huge military. Let's go use it. So you had a bunch of conservatives who were alienated from the rest of conservatism because they wanted to say stop. And then meanwhile, you had Rothbard, who felt like he belonged more or less on the American right, but he hadn't been able to really make that work because of the interventionism on the right. So he had gone from one thing to another. He had tried to see if he could make an alliance with the New Left, and he had started this newsletter and that project and whatever, just wherever he could find an audience for non-intervention. And now he said, I've finally come home, because now with the Cold War over, we can resume the conversation among people of relatively like mind. And so these people, these are all collectively thought of today as the paleos, the paleo conservatives who were for non-intervention in foreign policy, and the paleo libertarians, who of course were always for non-intervention. The paleocons were for non-intervention after the Cold War was over, but also who you might say the paleo libertarians were culturally conservative. They thought that there were too many elements of libertarianism that just wanted to gratuitously offend bourgeois sensibilities by being vociferously anti-religion or whatever. I mean, I remember during Holy Week a few years ago, the Libertarian Party thought it would be a nice idea to tweet out some quotations from the Church of Satan. You know, and I know they don't actually worship Satan. Like, you don't have to write to me. I already know all about it. But I mean, that's just pretty tone deaf. Like, why would you do that? It's just a dumb thing to do. And also, of course, we see today with a lot of culturally left libertarians that they seem more dedicated to that than they do to libertarianism. And whatever the latest left-wing fashion is, they just immediately rush to it. Rothbard didn't support that. He thought that was just, first of all, strategically dumb, and that a lot of these causes were almost exclusively wedded to the state. These were not just innocent little cultural causes that we can innocently support. They always bring the state in their train. So you can probably fill in some blanks as to examples of that. But let me get to the text here. Rothbard says that the old right is now back. Now, the old right is a term that he more or less coined. And what he's thinking about is kind of the disparate, not particularly well-organized movement, and even calling it a movement is too much, but the people who opposed the New Deal back in the 1930s. So whatever you could call right-wingism before World War II in the United States. That's what he means by the old right. Now, today, of course, the official conservative movement has think tanks and foundations and politicians and this and that, and you can see it. You can see it has a structure. The old right didn't have that. I mean, it did have some congressmen, like, for example, Howard Buffett, Warren's father. Howard Buffett was a tremendous congressman, totally laissez-faire and more or less Rothbardian. I'll get to him in a few minutes when Rothbard himself mentions Howard Buffett. So it was a bunch of individuals, kind of scattered, but that were more or less against the New Deal. So Rothbard says you had three groups in this old right. You had what he calls the extremists, the libertarians like Albert J. Nock, H.L. Mencken, Rose Wilder Lane, and Garrett Garrett. Now, Garrett Garrett, G-A-R-E-T, G-A-R-R-E-T-T. It might be Garrett Garrett, but I refuse to pronounce it that way. I want to pronounce it Garrett Garrett because I just love the idea that he changed his name to that, by the way. That's not his real name. So Garrett, I love Garrett Garrett, by the way. He wrote three small pieces. He wrote more than that, but he wrote for the Saturday Evening Post, and he wrote three small pieces that have been brought together in a book stupidly titled The People's Pottage. That's a terrible title. But you should read The People's Pottage because it's got three great essays. The Revolution Was, Ex-America, and The Rise of Empire. And you can't believe this is a contemporary observer. It's one thing for Rothbard and for libertarians 40 years later to look back on the New Deal. We've got this tremendously detailed analysis of what's wrong with it. But this guy was living through it, and he saw immediately everything that was wrong with it. Tremendous. So, in fact, let me write down People's Pottage. You'll just love Garrett Garrett. And by the way, another reason I think it's Garrett Garrett is that the biography of Garrett Garrett that was written is called Prophet's Prophet. So P-R-O-F-I-T'-S, and then P-R-O-P-H-E-T, Prophet's Prophet, Garrett Garrett. That doesn't work with Prophet's Prophet, Garrett Garrett. So I'm not doing that. I'm not doing it. I don't care what you tell me. His name is Garrett Garrett. Anyway, you'll love that guy. The second group, he says, were right-wing Democrats that were kind of leftovers from the laissez-faire 19th century Democrats. So you had like Albert Ritchie of Maryland, the governor there, or Senator James Reed of Missouri. And then the third group was the moderate group. The moderate group would be people who they could go along with some parts of the New Deal, but they thought it went too far, like Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover obviously favored some of these interventions because he pioneered them. And so Rothbard talks about Garrett Garrett and his ideas and the importance of reading him. But in addition to the domestic being against the New Deal, the old right was also against foreign interventionism. Those two things went together. And this is why Rothbard was so unhappy when the right wing became so interventionist abroad. He thought, no, you're breaking apart the two things that fit together, which is non-intervention domestically and non-intervention internationally. I love this particular paragraph. I have to read this to you. This is the question of how far would you roll government back? So he's saying, among the old right, we had these charming disagreements. There was nobody around to set a party line that people all had to agree with. But he says this, the minimum demand that almost all old rightists agree on, which virtually defined the old right, was total abolition of the New Deal, the whole kit and caboodle of the welfare state, the Wagner Act, the Social Security Act, going off gold in 1933, and all the rest. Beyond that, there were charming disagreements. Some would stop at repealing the New Deal. Others would press on to abolition of Woodrow Wilson's new freedom, including the Federal Reserve System and especially that mighty instrument of tyranny, the income tax and the Internal Revenue Service. Still others, extremists such as myself, would not stop until we repealed the Federal Judiciary Act of 1789 and maybe even think the unthinkable and restore the good old Articles of Confederation. So he says there were other differences, and these are differences we still have. Should we be Lockeans? Should we be Burkeans? Should we favor natural rights or be utilitarians or traditionalists? What should we be? Should we be Hamiltonians? Should we be Jeffersonians? And again, this could be debated. There was nobody setting a party line or expelling people or anything like that. So then Rothbard gets into the question of who are going to be the good guys and the bad guys in society. So for the Marxists, that's easy to figure out. The answer for the Marxists is the good guys will be the proletariat, and they are the people who are going to bring about change in society. Then the left wing got a little bit more eclectic, and it became the peasantry, oppressed womanhood, minorities, etc. But then the other side of the coin, he says, is really the relevant question. Who can we expect to be the bad guys? Who are the agents of negative social change? Or which groups in society pose the greatest threats to liberty? And he says basically the right wing has given two answers to that question: the masses themselves or the power elites. And Rothbard's going to get back to that question after he takes a little detour to give a little bit of his own personal background. He says he joined the old right in 1946. He says, I grew up in New York City. He told me this personally. I got more details about this one of the several times I got to meet him. I grew up in New York City in the 1930s in the midst of what can only be called a communist culture. He says, as middle-class Jews in New York, my relatives, friends, classmates, and neighbors faced only one great moral decision in their lives. Should they join the Communist Party and devote 100% of their lives to the cause, or should they remain fellow travelers and devote only a fraction of their lives? That was the great range of debate. He says, I had two sets of aunts and uncles on both sides of the family who were in the Communist Party and so on. But his father was different. He said, my father was an individualist, strongly anti-communist and anti-socialist, and in 1938 turned against the New Deal because it had failed to correct the Great Depression. And Rothbard said, that's a pretty good start. But he said, basically, in high school and in his college career, he never met a Republican. Or I guess he says he met there was a literature major he didn't have anything in common with, really, who was a Republican. But that also Lawrence Chamberlain, who was dean of Columbia College, admitted that he had never met a Republican either. And so these people travel in bubbles. They did then and they do now. He goes on to say that after the Republicans captured Congress in 1946, he was just ecstatic. He said, my first publication ever was a hallelujah letter in the New York World Telegram, exulting that now at last the Republican 80th Congress would repeal the entire New Deal. So much for my strategic acumen in 1946, he says. And then, he talks about some of the institutions. The Chicago Tribune was very important for the old right. He talks about Robert Taft, who was probably the most squishy and unreliable of people on the old right, but he still had many merits, certainly. But also Howard Buffett, congressman from Omaha, Nebraska, that I mentioned before. And this is very interesting. We have some correspondence between Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's father, and Murray Rothbard. Buffett writes to him that he's been making his way through Man, Economy, and State, which is Rothbard's huge economic treatise, and he would love to get it more widely read and publicized. And then he says, this is Howard Buffett. Somewhere I read that you had written a book on the Panic of 1819. If this is correct, I would like to know where I can buy a copy of it. Now, this is not in a strategy for the right. This is just a letter I'm reading to you that I found that is archived at the Mises Institute. And just because Rothbard mentions the name Howard Buffett, I thought it was an opportune moment to read from this letter. So he's asking about Rothbard's book on the Panic of 1819. If this is correct, I'd like to know where I can buy a copy of it. I have a son. He's talking about Warren, who is a particularly avid reader of books about panics and similar phenomena. I would like to present him with the book referred to. Anyway, so I always liked that letter. So let's get back to Rothbard's essay. He says, all right, now I've made my excursion into my personal background. Let's get into this question of the bad guys. Is it the masses or is it the elites? He says, well, first of all, let's grant for the sake of argument. Let's suppose the masses are just the worst, that they are just intolerant and awful and all that. He says, the fact is that the mass of people just don't have the time for politics and political shenanigans. The average person has to spend most of his time on the daily business of life. So being with his family, seeing friends, making a living. So he can only be involved in politics sporadically anyway. Who are the people who do have time for politics, who are going to rule over you? The professionals, the bureaucrats, the politicians, the special interest groups dependent on political rule, they make money out of politics. So they're going to be lobbying and active 24 hours a day. And these interest groups are going to be victorious over the masses. And that's more or less what public choice teaches us. So the problem is the ruling elite, the professionals and their dependent special interest groups. And then here's a second critical point. This is something that fascinated Rothbard. Society is divided into a ruling elite, which is always a minority of the population, and that ruling elite lives off the rest of the population, the productive population. And here Rothbard goes into a little bit of a discussion of John C. Calhoun's disquisition on government. Now, before we get into that disquisition on government, let me say a quick word about something that can help an awful lot of the people listening to this episode. And that has to do with our really, really great sponsor that I've used myself, BetterHelp. We've been reading all over the place that people's mental health has deteriorated quite a bit over the past 18 months. People have felt overwhelmed by helplessness, despair, and depression. Well, look, these past 18 months have been hard on all of us, but that doesn't have to mean that you should have to suffer in silence. Talk to somebody and start turning things around, and that's where BetterHelp comes in. They will assess your needs and match you with your own licensed professional therapist. You can schedule weekly video or phone sessions. It's more affordable than traditional offline counseling. Financial aid is available. The service is available all over the world, and the folks at BetterHelp can help you with a variety of different problems. So stress or anxiety or relationships or grief or family conflicts or anger or trauma, sleeping. Anything you share is confidential. It's convenient, professional, and affordable. You should check out the testimonials posted daily on their site. In fact, so many people have been using BetterHelp that they're recruiting additional counselors in all 50 states. I want you to start living a happier life today. As a listener, you'll get 10% off your first month by visiting betterhelp.com/woods. Join over 1 million people taking charge of their mental health. Again, that's BetterHelp, HELP.com/woods. All right, The Disquisition on Government by Calhoun was published posthumously in 1851. What Rothbard takes from it in particular is the distinction that Calhoun makes between the net taxpayers and the tax consumers. And the bigger government gets, the greater and more intense is the conflict between these classes. Again, that raises this question. You've got a minority of elites who tax and exploit everybody else. So here is the question. And Rothbard says that he likes to call it the mystery of civil obedience. He says, why does the majority of the public obey these turkeys anyway? He was very fond, Rothbard, of citing three people in coming to an answer to this question. Etienne de la Boétie, David Hume, and Ludwig von Mises. And they all had the same answer, which is that since the ruling class is a minority of the public, it's always a sliver of the public, they can't just rule by force. If it comes down to force, they're going to be overwhelmed by the majority. And even if you have a really bad dictatorship, it can't just operate by force alone. Doesn't mean the public is thrilled about it. The public may accept it in a spirit of passive resignation or hopelessness or whatever. But it's ideas that matter. And of course, Rothbard loved to point to the example of the collapse of the Soviet Union. He says, when the tanks were sent to capture Yeltsin, they were persuaded to turn their guns around and defend Yeltsin and the Russian parliament instead. And that was what was happening in Eastern Europe. I mean, if the police are going to turn the guns on the rulers, then it's all over. The minority gets overwhelmed by the majority. But why doesn't that always happen? How does the minority manage to tax and exploit everybody and get people to go along with that and think that's good and right and normal? And so the answer that Rothbard gives, building on those three figures I mentioned, was simply this. The reason the public more or less consents to this arrangement has to do with the role of the intellectuals. The intellectuals are the opinion-molding class of society. He says, if the masses knew what was going on, they would withdraw their consent quickly. They would soon perceive that the emperor has no clothes, that they're being ripped off, and that's where the intellectuals come in. He says, the ruling elite, whether it be the monarchs of yore or the communist parties of today, are in desperate need of intellectual elites to weave apologias for state power. The state rules by divine edict. The state ensures the common good or the general welfare. The state protects us from the bad guys over the mountain. The state guarantees full employment. The state activates the multiplier effect. The state ensures social justice, and on and on. The apologias differ over the centuries. The effect is always the same. And I want to continue reading directly from this. He says, we see what the state rulers get out of their alliance with the intellectuals, but what do the intellectuals get out of it? Intellectuals are the sort of people who believe that in the free market, they're getting paid far less than their wisdom requires. Now, the state is willing to pay them salaries, both for apologizing for state power. And of course, I hope everybody understands apologizing doesn't mean saying that I'm sorry. This is the the more archaic apology, like weaving a defense of state power, and in the modern state for staffing the myriad jobs in the welfare regulatory state apparatus. In past centuries, the churches constituted the exclusive opinion-molding classes in the society. Hence the importance to the state and its rulers of an established church, and the importance to libertarians of the concept of separating church and state, which really means not allowing the state to confer upon one group a monopoly of the opinion-molding function. In the 20th century, of course, the church has been replaced in its opinion-molding role, or in that lovely phrase, the engineering of consent, by a swarm of intellectuals, academics, social scientists, technocrats, policy scientists, social workers, journalists, and the media generally, and on and on. Often included for old time's sake, so to speak, is a sprinkling of social gospel ministers and counselors from the mainstream churches. So to sum up, the problem is that the bad guys, the ruling classes, have gathered unto themselves the intellectual and media elites who are able to bamboozle the masses into consenting to their rule, to indoctrinate them, as the Marxists would say, with false consciousness. What can we, the right-wing opposition, do about it? All right, so Rothbard's going to consider a couple of approaches, and one of them is an approach that F.A. Hayek recommended, really, which is we want to try to convince people at the top, like the top scholars and philosophers, convince them, because then if they wind up being on our side, then the ideas will trickle down from them into society at large. Rothbard is unconvinced because he says, first of all, this is a rather genteel strategy requiring quiet persuasion. And he says this is the kind of strategy that we would expect from Hayek, who was not exactly an intellectual gut fighter. It matches his personality. And of course, ideas and persuasion are important. Nobody denies that. But he says the problem with this strategy is going to take hundreds of years. And as Rothbard says, some of us are a bit more impatient than that. But the other thing is, there are certain mysterious blockages of the trickle. So if you guys happen to remember the scare about Alar on the apples back in the 1980s, Rothbard says thus, most real scientists have a very different view of such environmental questions as Alar than do a few left-wing hysterics, and yet somehow it is always the same few hysterics that are exclusively quoted by the media. So see, this is what he means. If your strategy is we'll start with the elites, we'll try to convert them, and then the ideas will trickle down, well, even if we do that, for some reason, there's a blockage in the trickle because the people with our ideas don't wind up being the ones on television. Now, why is that? What's going on here? So he says the media skew the result. They pick and choose the few leftists in the field because they have a bias. They have that bias. And then Rothbard says, more generally, the Hayekian trickle-down model overlooks a crucial point that, and I hate to break this to you, intellectuals, academics, and the media are not all motivated by truth alone. As we have seen, the intellectual classes may be part of the solution, but they are also a big part of the problem. For as we have seen, the intellectuals are part of the ruling class, and their economic interests, as well as their interests in prestige, power, and admiration, are wrapped up in the present welfare-warfare state system. And so Rothbard says this. So therefore, in addition to converting intellectuals to the cause, the proper course for the right-wing opposition must necessarily be a strategy of boldness and confrontation, of dynamism and excitement, a strategy, in short, of rousing the masses from their slumber and exposing the arrogant elites that are ruling them, controlling them, taxing them, and ripping them off. So then Rothbard mentions another strategy. It might be called the Fabian strategy, because the Fabian socialists in Britain were thinking that we'll get socialism little by little, not with one extraordinary and sudden revolution, but through little bits and pieces here. We make an advance here, an advance there. And we see this kind of approach represented in some of the think tanks, because they think, well, we'll try and repeal a little bit of this regulation over here and a little bit over there, and little by little we'll make our way to a free society. And Rothbard says that the flaw with that is that what works to increase state power does not work in reverse. The Fabians were pushing the state and the ruling elite in the direction they wanted to move in anyway. But when you're pushing in the opposite direction, you're going against the interests of huge numbers of people and interest groups who 24 hours a day are dedicated to stopping you. And now we come to Rothbard endorsing what we might today call right-wing populism. And oh boy, do the left libertarians not like that. And so again, I want to read to you what Rothbard is saying, because when you hear it, you understand, yeah, of course this is the approach that needs to be taken. What other approach is there? Boring people to death? Well, if we're super sweet and abide by the rules, what's that going to do? It's not going to make people who already hate you and will always hate you suddenly like you. The elites are not suddenly going to like you if you play by the rules and you're super sweet, you don't rock the boat, and you make sure and let them all know we're not like those extreme libertarians over there. We're the respectable ones. Yeah, okay. Like they make distinctions like that. Give me a break. So here's what Rothbard says. It is important to realize that the establishment doesn't want excitement in politics. It wants the masses to continue to be lulled to sleep. It wants kinder, gentler. It wants the measured, judicious, mushy tone and content of a James Reston, a David Broder, or a Washington Week in Review. It doesn't want a Pat Buchanan, not only for the excitement and hard edge of his content, but also for his similar tone and style. And so the proper strategy for the right wing must be what we can call right-wing populism, exciting, dynamic, tough, and confrontational, rousing and inspiring not only the exploited masses, but the often shell-shocked right-wing intellectual cadre as well. And in this era, where the intellectual and media elites are all establishment liberal conservatives, all in a deep sense one variety or another of social democrat, all bitterly hostile to a genuine right, we need a dynamic, charismatic leader who has the ability to short-circuit the media elites and to reach and rouse the masses directly. We need a leadership that can reach the masses and cut through the crippling and distorting hermeneutical fog spread by the media elites. But can we call such a strategy conservative? I, for one, am tired of the liberal strategy on which they have rung the changes for 40 years of presuming to define conservatism as a supposed aid to the conservative movement. Whenever liberals have encountered hard-edged abolitionists who, for example, have wanted to repeal the New Deal or Fair Deal, they say, but that's not genuine conservatism, that's radicalism. The genuine conservative, these liberals go on to say, doesn't want to repeal or abolish anything. He is a kind and gentle soul who wants to conserve what left liberals have accomplished. The left liberal vision, then, of good conservatives is as follows. First, left liberals in power make a great leap forward toward collectivism. Then, when in the course of the political cycle, 4 or 8 years later, conservatives come to power, they, of course, are horrified at the very idea of repealing anything. They simply slow down the rate of growth of statism, consolidating the previous gains of the left, and providing a bit of R&R for the next liberal great leap forward. And if you think about it, you will see that this is precisely what every Republican administration has done since the New Deal. Conservatives have readily played the desired Santa Claus role in the liberal vision of history. I would like to ask, how long are we going to keep being suckers? This is still Rothbard. How long will we keep playing our appointed roles in the scenario of the left? When are we going to stop playing their game and start throwing over the table? That's what he's talking about. And that's completely unobjectionable. Now, he doesn't like the word conservative. He says, conservative? What do I want to conserve about the status quo? He said, maybe there was a case for calling us conservatives in 1910, but surely not now. We want to uproot the conservative. We want to uproot the status quo, not conserve it. And then plus conservative, well, that just harks back to 19th century Europe, and those are completely different conditions and different issues. So it's just unhelpful. So then he speculates on terminology and so on and so forth. Now, there's some other great material that comes up here. But now, finally, he gets to the present. And he says that what Pat Buchanan represents is the return of the old right, of a right wing that really doesn't care what the respectable people say, just does not care, and can't be controlled by them, and does favor non-intervention abroad. And now they're back, and they're feisty, and yeah, they are dynamic and exciting and not boring policy wonks. They're not Mitt Romney. They're not Tim Pawlenty. They're not any of these sorts of people. And so, of course, Buchanan got criticized for this and that and the other thing. And so you have to hear Rothbard dealing with this. He says, the response to this, the emergence of the old right, he says, is very much like the reaction to the return of Godzilla in the old movies. And wouldn't you know, they would trot out the old psychobabble as well as the old smears of bigotry, anti-Semitism, the specter of Franco, and all the rest. Every interview with an article on Pat dredges his authoritarian Catholic background. Ooh, that's Rothbard's ooh. And the fact that he fought a lot when he was a kid, gee whiz, like most of the American male population. Also, that Pat has been angry a lot. Ooh, anger. And of course, since Pat is not only a right-winger, but hails from a designated oppressor group, white male Irish Catholic, his anger can never be righteous rage, but only a reaction of a paranoid, status-anxious personality filled with resentment. And then Rothbard turns to, what happened to the old right anyway? And his answer, you can get the details by looking at it, but his answer is the coming to influence of National Review, particularly at a time when there was an intellectual and power vacuum on the old right, because much of its leadership was dead or in retirement. Senator Taft had died. Colonel McCormick from the Chicago Tribune had died. Many of the right-wing congressmen had retired. And filling that void was Bill Buckley, fresh from some time in the CIA, and National Review. They transformed the right, he said, into this global crusading movement. And what they wanted to do was to get rid of any influences on the right that could deprive this new conservative movement of the respectability that it sought. And so they began to purge different groups. So Ayn Randians were gone. Anti-Zionists, so-called isolationists, so John T. Flynn, who had done tremendous work, was out. The various heretics of one sort or another, the John Birch Society, all of them were out because we need to be respectable. And this paved the way for what Rothbard calls that final fateful influx, that of the ex-Trotskyite right-wing social democrat, Democrat capitalist, Truman Humphrey, Scoop Jackson liberals, displaced from their home in the Democratic Party by the loony left that we know so well. And he says, and so the neocons have managed to establish themselves as the only right-wing alternative to the left. They've managed to establish the notion that anyone who might be to the right of them is by definition a representative of the forces of darkness, of chaos, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how the dice have been loaded in our current political game, says Rothbard. And virtually the only prominent media exception, the only genuine rightist spokesman who has managed to escape neocon anathema has been Pat Buchanan. And he says, so now it was time. It was time to trot out old Bill Buckley and National Review for another purge, to write his 40,000-word essay in search of anti-Semitism. And Rothbard says it's unreadable. He says, reading the whole thing through is doing penance for one's sins, and one can accomplish the task only if possessed by a stern sense of duty, as one grits one's teeth and plows through a pile of turgid and pointless student term papers, which indeed Buckley's essay matches in content, in learning, and in style. See, there's Rothbard. There's a guy who is in your face and exciting and not a boring policy wonk guy. Now, the particulars of who's an anti-Semite and who isn't and all that, from this 1992 essay is not really what matters to us right now. It's all ridiculous nonsense, as you might imagine. And the various victims do defend themselves. Gore Vidal defends himself. The Nation magazine defended itself. What matters, says Rothbard, is that, look, the world is different now. It's not 1958 anymore. National Review is no longer the monopoly power center on the right. There are people popping up all over the place, new people, young people, who don't care at all what Bill Buckley has to say. It doesn't matter anymore. The original right and all its heresies are back. And he says Bill Buckley is like the Mikhail Gorbachev of the conservative movement. So like Gorbachev, Bill goes on with his old act, but like Gorbachev, nobody trembles anymore. Nobody bends the knee and goes into exile. Nobody cares anymore. Nobody except the good old New York Times. And then we get this. I'll just read little bits of the conclusion. When I was growing up, says Rothbard, I found that the main argument against laissez-faire and for socialism was that socialism and communism were inevitable. You can't turn back the clock, they chanted. You can't turn back the clock. But the clock of the once mighty Soviet Union, the clock of Marxism-Leninism, a creed that once mastered half the world, is not only turned back, but lies dead and broken forever. Daniel Bell wrote a volume back in the 60s about the right wing in which he and other contributors psychoanalyzed them. Why do they hold these peculiar opinions? And it's all because they're crazy, conspiracy-minded inferiors who have status anxiety and whatever. It's typical BS. But Rothbard says, one of the authors of the Daniel Bell volume says, in horror and astonishment, that the radical right intends to repeal the 20th century. Heaven forfend! Who would want to repeal the 20th century, the century of horror, the century of collectivism, the century of mass destruction and genocide? Who would want to repeal that? Well, we propose to do just that. With the inspiration of the death of the Soviet Union before us, we now know that it can be done. We shall break the clock of social democracy. We shall break the clock of the Great Society. We shall break the clock of the welfare state. We shall break the clock of the New Deal. We shall break the clock of Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom and Perpetual War. We shall repeal the 20th century. One of the most inspiring and wonderful sights of our time was to see the peoples of the Soviet Union rising up last year to tear down in their fury the statues of Lenin, to obliterate the Leninist legacy. We too shall tear down all the statues of Franklin D. Roosevelt, of Harry Truman, of Woodrow Wilson, melt them down and beat them into plowshares and pruning hooks, and usher in a 21st century of peace, freedom, and prosperity. Now, if that doesn't rile you up, I don't know what will. If that doesn't make you want to go read Rothbard, I give up. So go to tomwoods.com/1961. Look at what Lou recommends in terms of titles and get reading, because this guy is our most important intellectual influence, simply for the sheer volume of his output, the diversity of topics he covered, the thoroughness with which he covered them, the encyclopedic scope of his knowledge, and, as you can hear in his prose, his passionate dedication to the cause. That's Murray Rothbard. So check that all out at tomwoods.com/1961. If you like the Tom Woods Show, if you think it's doing some good in the world, then become a supporter and join me inside the Tom Woods Show elite at supportinglisteners.com. I'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.